Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to focus on how I actually painted that shadow and how I painted the rest of the wall, right? So I'm going to use a dark wash to paint the shadow. So that is a pretty dark gray, and again we see how we actually make gray, that is mixing black with water. So that is used to paint this layer of the shadow. So this darker gray is painted on top of that very light gray which you have seen earlier, and so in this dark area right here, that actually makes up the shadow of the pipe. Right, so later on we are going to paint some of the details underneath that shadow, but first we would need to make sure that this layer of the shadow is dry before we can do anything on top of it. But when we do things on top of it, actually it is showing the details which is below, underneath that shadow, which is the all those peeling walls, all the textures on the walls which we can see through that shadow because it is not completely black. So again, just trying to touch up this shadow right here. I'm just making sure that the gray here is consistent, and so I'm using that brush to make sure that we have this consistent wash. So right now, while waiting for it to dry, I'm actually doing the rest of the walls. So one very good strategy is when you're waiting for the water to dry, we want to paint the other area so that we do not idle around and we do not waste time, and after that layer is dry we can come back and do whatever that we want on top of it, right? So right now we are doing the top right here, where we have this light brown that is used to paint the peeling wall, and right here we can see that we have all these different browns and different orange and even reds, and by using this dry brush technique we are able to paint these peeling walls. Right, so using that small brush again, just painting this lighter brown area which is just beside that shadow, and you can see I'm actually using like really light kind of a grayish tone and a brownish kind of tone to paint this area which is like really light, and just using my fingers to kind of smudge it. So again, the way that we actually do these areas is by using that small brush, dry brush technique, and by using the fingers to smudge. Right, so again using my finger to kind of like spread out the paint that I've just added using my small brush. Right, so now we are moving towards the shadow area, and as you can see right now the shadow area is almost dry. Just making sure that it is dry before we actually embark on the painting of the shadow area, right? So using the brush, I'm just trying to make sure that this area is dry, just making sure that even if it is not yet dry, making sure that this marks that I make will not spread out too much. So right now I'm using a small brush to paint the details underneath the shadow once it is dry. So that is done by using this small brush, again adding in some of that dark blue, right? So very good tip is to add dark blue, and by adding dark blue to this black we can form this very interesting darks. So right now you can see that we have all these marks and all these shadows that we can see using all these strokes that is done using my small brush. And so we have all these different kinds of strokes and all these small bits and larger pieces, and all these actually show the textures of the walls. Right, so right now just trying to repeat the same thing underneath that shadow, and so we have this very interesting mix of peeling kind of textures and all these old textures that is black because it is underneath that shadow, and that is how we actually paint those things that is underneath a shadow. So one way is that you can paint all these things first and then the shadow goes on top, but the problem with that is that when the shadow goes on top of those details, it may smudge the details and it may not appear sharp. So when you paint the shadow first and then the details later, then it will appear sharp, as what I'm doing right now. So right now is actually the recommended way that I recommend you to actually try out, because that is the best way to make the details sharper, by painting in the shadow first. Okay, so right now I'm just painting the surroundings, and you can see right now that the shadow is more realistic because of all those details that are being painted below it, right? So using my fingers, I'm kind of like trying to make sure we have all these, you know, different browns and all these lighter browns. So you can see right there, the browns below that stronger brown at the top is actually lighter in color. And so we have all these different kinds of browns and all these different kinds of, you know, lighter browns that is below that yellowish area. So I used browns to create all these dry textures, and again, these browns are of different kinds of tones and hues because we have all these different kinds of light browns, yellowish browns, reddish browns, grayish browns, and all these even greenish browns. So all these different kinds of browns will really give us some very rich kinds of colors when we actually use the dry brush. Again, using the dry brush and our fingers, that is the best way that we actually do we can actually use to do the textures of the walls. Right, so right here we can see that I'm actually using this small brush to make sure that we have all these different kinds of, you know, dry textures that are being added. So you can see right there that I didn't apply this evenly because some parts of the wall have less of these dry textures, but some parts have more, and so we can actually make sure that we have all these different kinds of, you know, light and dark areas, and some parts are more intense yellow and some parts with less intense kind of yellow, and also more intense, more darker browns and all that. So these kinds of changes will make sure that you have all these kinds of things that are going on, and this will not bore the viewer because they can see all these changes on the walls when they actually look at it. And you can see right now the bottom part is actually whiter. Right, so I'm using the finger to kind of like blend these dry textures with the rest of the wall, and so this will make sure that we have all these different kinds of, you know, textures that are being added, and so we have all these kinds of very nice textures. And of course we can use these dots. So these dots are being added so that we can have all these, you know, marks, all these like small little dots, small little bits of dirt that is on the wall. And when we add more of these kinds of, you know, things on the wall, that will make it more realistic and more convincing. Right, so using the fingers and using the, you know, the small brush, just trying to touch up on this part of the wall. Right, so now we are moving on to the left hand side, and very quickly we are now moving on to this part where there's a lot of textures again. So we're just trying to repeat the same kind of method. Right, so you can see I actually changed the water because we want to have clean water. We want to have the best result when it comes to, you know, painting all these watercolor paint on top, and having this water will give us the best kind of you know, way to actually mix the colors, and that will help us to get the most accurate colors that we want. Alright, so we have these different kinds of dry brush, and again this dry brush is being done, you know, just below that red area, just below that, you know, dark brown, dark red kind of area. And this is very important when we try to combine all these different things. So we need to have this very strong area, and then we need to actually combine that strong area with, you know, a lighter area, and that will give rise to a very interesting visual effect. Right, so you can see the top part here is pretty strong with that darker kind of red, with that, you know, darker kind of brown, and we can make sure that we combine, you know, all these things together. So using the small brush, I'm drawing some lines. So these lines actually separate the peeling part of the wall with the part that is white. So that's why I'm actually using these black lines to separate between the peeling part and the non-peeling part. Okay, so that is important as well, to use lines in our painting. So now I'm using the small brush to kind of like paint these yellow areas, and these yellow areas are being combined with some browns. So again, using different colors, using yellows, using browns, light browns and dark browns, and combining all these different parts and different, you know, kinds of browns that will give you very nice changes and transitions. Right, so now I'm using my fingers to kind of like, you know, dab into the water and dab into the gray paint, and you can see how I spread out. So by using the fingers, I can make use of my fingers to paint all these, you know, very light, very light gray tones on the top part of the wall, which is much cleaner, but you can see it is not completely white. And so I'm using my fingers to kind of like smudge all these very light, very subtle tones, so that we can have all these grays and all these very nice kind of textures that is used to do the smoother part of the wall, but it is not completely white. So that's how we actually do it. Right, so now we are just trying to make sure that we have all these textures in place. Right, so I would like to dwell a little bit more on these textures, because this is a very good technique for many of the students to actually try to pick up, because this one technique will help you to be able to paint many kinds of textures, especially when you're doing like old walls, especially when you're doing all these very nice kind of rustic wall. Right, so again, using my finger to kind of like make sure we have these browns. So right here the browns are pretty similar, but we are going to combine that with the other browns. Okay, so how we do it is actually to put the brush in to the water, and this is not really dry brush because we're using a lot of water right here, so just trying to fill up this area with those browns. Right, so the thing is, what happened was I was in this area called Udaipur. So Udaipur is a city in Rajasthan. It is one of the more well-known cities, and it's called the City of Lakes because we have a few lakes right here, right? So it's Lake Pichola is the most well-known lake here, and so while walking along one of the alleys, there's a lot of all these alleys inside the town. So there's like the main square, there's like the temple, and then after that you can walk further down into all these, you know, alleys. And while I was walking on one of those alleys, I actually saw this man. This old man was actually, you know, looking at me, and I kind of like snapped a photo of him because he looked very interesting with, you know, the mustache, and of course the wall behind him was interesting, and of course everything about this place is very interesting because it is a very interesting place. India is a very interesting foreign and rustic kind of cultural kind of place, and with his beard, you know, his skin tones, and this wall behind him with the pipe and everything. So I kind of like snapped a picture of him as he was looking directly at me, and the sunlight was actually forming a very nice effect on his face as well, and of course on all the things that you see on the walls. And so I decided to paint this picture because I thought it was very special to have all these different kinds of tones and textures that make up the walls. And of course later on, in the later parts of my videos, you will be able to see how I painted the old man himself. Right, so now we are moving on to the top part here, which is the rest of the textures. So we're focusing a lot on textures here, just trying to use some gray tones, and you can see how the gray tones are actually combining with the rest of the brown tones, and we have all these different kinds of tones, subtly different tones that are close to each other, and that will give us very, very interesting effects. Alright, so we are now almost done with this area, which is just above his head, and we are trying to replicate this entire area using this small brush. Right, so we need a little bit of patience here, because sometimes it is not easy to actually see this thing coming alive, because it can take quite some time, especially when you're using this small brush that is covering a very small area at any particular point of time. And so we would need to make sure that we have that patience to see all these things coming alive, and to see all these things showing up. And when it doesn't really have that kind of effect, then we can add new layer on top, and that will, all these additional details will create more interest when it comes to all these textures. Right, so it doesn't matter if you can't get it right the first time, because I didn't get it right the first time either. And it is important for us to really make sure that we have all these techniques. And right now I'm actually trying to show how I'm using my fingers again to smudge all these marks that I just made. So just to make it lighter, just to make them lighter. So it's important for us to have these lighter marks that is combined with these darker marks, right? So again, using that small brush, just trying to combine all these lighter kind of marks together. So the thing is, when you actually look at a white wall, the wall is not completely white. So it is a very interesting thing to kind of like trying to reproduce all these lighter tones on the wall, because you see that they are subtle, but when you actually create that onto your painting, that will give more interesting kind of effect. And so that is a really nice thing to do, right? Even though they are like pretty light in tone and pretty, not obvious, but when we try to create everything, when we try to paint everything together, you will see that they come together very nicely, and they actually make up a very important part of the painting, which you wouldn't have noticed if you didn't paint this picture. So that's a very important point that we need to talk about, because when we paint these walls, often we miss out a lot of details, as what I always did in the past. But as I observed more closely, I actually included all these details in, and all these details actually give rise to very, very lively kind of textures and effects, and all these techniques can really bring your painting alive when you try to reproduce all these things. Right, so at the top left hand corner right there, we can see that all these details are not they are kind of like segregated from each other. They are not like those large areas where you have all these textures. So these kinds of textures are being done because we have all these different darker parts, and they are like small areas. So it's kind of like cracks on the wall, but they are not really cracks. They are like maybe some kind of marks, and maybe some of them are cracks, but they show the kind of like peeling nature of the wall that you can really admire when you see this thing coming together. Right, so using my fingers, I'm just trying to blend in everything. So again, using these horizontal strokes on my fingers, that will really help me to make sure that we have all these very nice kind of strokes, okay, very nice kind of marks that I can actually do with my fingers. So the fingers are the best tool when it comes to smudging. So if you use Photoshop, you use that smudge tool, you can see that finger right there, and that's the reason why they actually use that, because it is the best tool to actually use for smudging, not the brush, not a small brush, not a large brush, but using that finger. And for me, I kind of like use the middle finger and also my palms to make sure that we have all these things being smudged, and this blurry kind of effect is the best way to kind of like depict all these very light and subtle tones. Right, so again, using some of my fingers. So another good way is to use the fingers to dab directly into the paint itself. So if the paint is dry, just use a little bit of water to kind of like make sure the paint comes out a little bit. And using those paints, like for example light blue, we can just make sure that the fingers are covered with that light blue, and then we can kind of like smudge it onto the paper. And when we smudge it further, it becomes lighter, and that's how we actually use the fingers to make sure that we have all these light tones that are being added. So right now we have this small brush, and this small brush right here is done to make sure that we have all these sharp areas that is making up those details right there. And so it is important for us to make sure that we have all these light areas and all these dark kinds of tones. And again, you can right now you can see that these details are coming together, and you can see they are becoming more and more realistic because I have used my fingers to kind of like combine all these different bits that were segregated, they were separated before that, but because of the movement of my fingers and this smudging and dabbing kind of effect, they are actually coming together more nicely and in a more convincing way. Right, so we have this small brush, and I'm using this small brush to kind of like make sure we have more marks. Okay, this marks right there are actually very important to actually show that the whole thing is complete, because if we don't have enough textures, then that part may seem empty and incomplete. And so we want to make sure that we do all the details when we look at the original photo itself. Just make sure every part of that dirt and that small little bits are being included into the wall, and that will actually make the wall come out even more alive. Okay, so just using that small brush, I'm just trying to make sure that we have all these different kinds of darker kinds of tones for those dry brush, those small little bits right there. Okay, so we have all these different kinds of bits and all these different kinds of strokes of the brush. So right there we can see the top left hand corner is coming together with the rest of the painting, because right now I'm adding more details, and these additional details actually add more life to the painting. Just trying to use my hand to kind of like spread out a little bit more of those amazing details. So we don't want to just leave it as that, because we want to make sure that it's natural. So one way to make sure that it's natural is actually to make it sit onto the wall. And one way to do that is to actually make sure the sides are kind of like smudged so that it seems like they are part of the wall rather than just floating on top. So that's another skill, another kind of a technique that I would like to share with you. So right now I'm just using the brush to very quickly make sure that we have all these peeling parts of the wall that are being done. And so we have all these different kinds of browns and all these dry brush techniques which I've just showed you, and I'm just repeating the same thing, and so it is being reproduced in a very nice way, in a very convincing way. And you can see I also use a little bit of that green to show a little bit of that moss area. Right, so very quickly, just trying to complete this part of the painting. Right, so right now I actually reached the bottom part here. So I used light brown to paint the wood. Okay, so this part of the wood is actually where he's sitting, and this man is actually leaning against this wooden part of the stair. There's this stairs right there, and you can see behind him there's this wood. Right, so we have some of the brown tones that are being added, and later on you can see that I will use this brown kind of dark brown tone to actually paint the shadow of the wall. Right, so we have this light brown tones, right? So using that brush, I'm just kind of like trying to make sure we have all these dry brush techniques that show all these different browns that make up the side of this wood right here. I'm just using the brush to very quickly make sure we have all these different kinds of browns and lighter browns and darker browns with dry brush techniques. So all these different browns are very important when it comes to painting the textures of the wood. So we can see that the wood is not completely smooth, right? And so we would need to make sure we have all these different kinds of wood, different kinds of brown. Right, so right now I'm just using this dark brown to paint the shadow of the wood. So you can leave it white, but you can also paint the base layer like one layer across. So I didn't have to leave it white, okay, so that this darker brown can actually go on top, but leaving white is fine as well. So just make sure that this part of the shadow is darker than the rest of the wood. Alright, so we have this darker brown that is being added, and then again once it's dry we'll add in the details later, which is similar to the technique I've shown you earlier in this video, how I actually used the small brush to paint the details on top of the shadow of the pipe earlier on. Right, so now while waiting for this dark brown to dry, I'm using the small brush to kind of like do the details surrounding it, okay, because those parts are dry. So I can kind of like use the brush to very quickly go through all these, you know, different kinds of details, and this is done by using that small brush, again drawing all those lines and all those strokes that will make up the rest of the wood right there. So while waiting for it to dry, we can do the other parts, like trying to complete this part of the wood, which is you know, it consists of all these dry brush techniques. And all these dry brush techniques are very important for us, you know, to do the side of the wood. And so this part here is actually pretty simple, almost like doing those wall textures, but making sure it looks rough by doing all those textures. Right, so now I'm just testing whether the brown, dark brown there is dry. So right now I'm just going to paint the final part of this part right here. So right now it is pretty dry, and we can just proceed on to paint the darker details which is inside that darker kind of brown, right? So again, using this brush, I'm just trying to make sure that we have all these different kinds of strokes that is used to make up this part of the wood. Right, and so we have all these thicker strokes and thinner strokes and all these very nice details that is used to do the details of the wood. And so in this video right here, we have seen how I actually paint the wall textures, how I actually paint the details underneath those shadows, and these are some of the very useful techniques that I would like to share with you today. Hey everyone, it's KY Tom here. Thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed my video, please hit the like button and comment down below. Do consider to subscribe to my channel for more art videos. Check out the links on the description below to find out more about my art, and I hope to see you in the next one.